Few ideas challenge a nation like war, a force that both galvanizes and divides people. On July 28th, 1812, in one of the largest cities in the nation, those competing forces came together in a disagreement in which, ironically, supporters of a new war attacked heroes of the last war. Among America's conflicts, the War of 1812 is arguably one of the least remembered and least understood, but perhaps even less understood is the way in which that war divided the nation. The 1812 Baltimore riots are history that deserve to be remembered. The War of 1812, which with almost comic irony lasted 4 years, is admittedly a difficult war to understand. The still young United States was ill prepared for a war, especially against the world's greatest naval power, while the United Kingdom was in no need of distraction while in a struggle for its very existence against revolutionary France. While France had sided with the United States during our war for independence, the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century had caused a growing resentment, a rift that had led to an undeclared naval war between 1798 and 1800, and a growing anti-French sentiment in an America that had largely reconciled with its former colonial master. War was generally opposed by both Presidents Jefferson and Madison, who took steps to avoid it, as well as the British Crown, which historian Amanda Foreman noted in Smithsonian Magazine in 2014, had given orders to Royal Navy ships near the American coastline not to give any just cause of offense to the government or the subjects of the United States. Yet somehow two nations that could not afford and did not want war found themselves at war nonetheless. The central issue was in Europe, when Napoleon had declared economic war against Britain via his continental system, which banned trade between Britain and the French Empire, and Britain had responded with the Orders in Council, which Foreman explains prohibited neutral ships from trading with Napoleonic Europe except under license. Moreover, the British had a practice of stopping American ships and searching them for purportedly British deserters. While the Royal Navy argued that this was a matter of British sovereignty over its people, it was more direct than that. The U.S. National Park Service explains the number of seamen needed to crew British ships nearly tripled between 1793 and 1812, from 36,000 to 114,000. At the same time, the life of a Royal Navy sailor became steadily more brutal. Voluntary enlistments could never satisfy the demand for sailors. Admiral Nelson opined that without a press, I have no idea how our fleet can be manned. To the British, impressment, even involving stopping and searching neutral shipping, was a matter of survival. The British knew full well that these actions would anger the United States. When the Orders in Council were issued, Foreign Secretary George Canning had written, "We have now a maritime war in our power, unfettered by any considerations of whom we may annoy or whom we may offend, and we have determination to carry it through." America tried both diplomacy and economic warfare, an embargo on all trade, to convince the British to recognize American maritime rights. Madison, who sought alternatives to war, slowly changed his opinion. History professor Harvey Strum of Queen's College, Ontario, explained in the journal World Affairs in 1980. By the winter of 1811-1812, President Madison had become convinced that war was the only option open to the United States to win British respect of American maritime rights. But perhaps more importantly, Madison, a Democrat-Republican, saw the problem in light of growing influence of his opposition, the Federalist Party, in the wake of economic downturn as a result of the embargo. Strum continues, increasingly convinced that the failure of the Republican administration to win British recognition of American rights threatened Republican control of the national government. President Madison and other party leaders opted for war. When Madison finally decided to call for war, he delivered a speech to Congress on June 1st, 1812. In it, he talked about interference with trade. Our commerce has been plundered in every sea. And impressment. Thousands of American citizens, under the safeguard of public law and their national flag, have been torn from their country and from everything dear to them, have been dragged on board ships of war of a foreign nation and exposed under the severest of their discipline to be exiled to the most distant and deadly climes, to risk their lives in battles of their oppressors. And another bone of contention, British collaboration with Native American tribes in the frontier, which he argued was the cause of a warfare which is known to spare neither age nor sex, and to be distinguished by features peculiarly shocking to humanity. While the British, Foreman writes, regarded the U.S. protest against Royal Navy impressment of American seamen as exaggerated whining at best, and regarded the American declaration of war as being about wounded feelings and inconvenience, Americans saw the British actions as an attack on our national pride as well as our trade, and was spun by some as a second war for independence. But the difference in perspectives between the British and the Americans hid another issue. The Americans decidedly did not agree on going to war. That showed in Congress. The war that Madison had asked for on June 1st was finally declared on June 18th by the narrowest margin by which the nation has ever declared war. The vote in the House was 79 to 49, in the Senate 19 to 13. Opposed unanimously by the Federalist Party, members of the House published an appeal to their constituents on the subject of war with Great Britain. They offered objections, both for practical reasons, saying the inadequacy of both our Army and Navy for successful invasion, and the insufficiency of the fortifications for the security of our seaboard were everywhere known, and a system of peace was the policy which most comported with the character, condition, and interest of the United States, saying, a nation like the United States, happy in its local relations, removed from the bloody theater of Europe with a maritime border opening a vast field for enterprise, with territorial possessions exceeding every real want, its fireside safe, its altars undefiled, from invasion nothing to fear, from acquisition nothing to hope, how shall such a nation look to heaven for its smiles, while throwing away, as though they are worthless, all the blessings and joys which peace and such a distinguished lot include? With what prayers can it address the Most High when it prepares to pour forth its youthful rage upon a neighboring people, from whose strength it has nothing to dread, from whose devastation it has nothing to gain? In the simplest terms, the American Battlefield Trust explains, especially in New England, Federalists were as a rule more concerned with maintaining a positive trade relationship with Britain than national honor, whereas the war hawks of the Democratic Republican Party, more represented in the South and West, were concerned not just with the practical consequences of British aggression, but also with a sense of national honor. They felt that Britain failed to acknowledge American sovereignty, and that another victorious war would serve as a second war of independence. More practically, the West already largely supported the Democrat Republicans, and they were those most concerned with ongoing conflict with native tribes that they saw as being supported and instigated by British agents. However, the Battlefield Trust explains, once war began, many Federalists rallied to the cause for national unity. Volunteers came from all over the young country, including the heart of New England. At the same time, the war was highly unpopular in the areas most dependent on British trade. Unhappy Federalists called it Mr. Madison's War. Baltimore, by 1812 the third largest city in the U.S., boasting more than 47,000 residents, was staunchly pro-war. It had to do with the nature of the population. The Battlefield Trust writes, the majority of the population of Baltimore at the time was Democrat-Republican, the party that favored the war. Many of the residents were immigrants, many of whom had immigrated to escape British rule. They were highly resentful of the British. There was another reason as well, as the Trust explains. Shipbuilders in Baltimore, many of them both free and enslaved black men, built some of the most maneuverable and fastest ships currently on the water. Baltimore would make a good deal of money during the war, much of which was fought through organized piracy called privateering. The Trust notes, the Baltimore privateers were immensely successful. The Baltimore Clipper was primarily used by privateers and was known as one of the quickest ships in the world. 122 vessels made up the Baltimore privateer fleet, and by the war's end, these ships would cost $16 million of damage to the British and capture about a third of all British vessels captured. For good reason, the British dubbed Baltimore a nest of pirates. And it was in Baltimore that perhaps the greatest illustration of the disagreement over the war was demonstrated. Journalist Blaine Taylor wrote in a 2011 edition of Warfare History Network, one of Baltimore's less flattering nicknames is Mob Town, and there have been several notable riots in the city's history. Perhaps the least known of these riots was the first, the Great Baltimore Riot of 1812. It is a lurid tale and does few people involved in it much credit, including some later genuine heroes of the war. Among the Federalists who opposed the war was Alexander C. Hansen, a member of the Maryland House of Delegates. Hansen published a paper in Baltimore called the Federal Republican and Commercial Gazette. The Gazette was sharply worded in its attacks on the Democrat Republicans. In 1811, Hansen called Madison "whiffling Jemmy." There is scarcely an act of tyranny and oppression complained of against George III, which has not been committed by Jefferson and his political pimp, Whiffling Jemmy. But historian Joseph Herman Schongiger wrote in a 1940 edition of the Maryland Historical Magazine, when war was declared against England in June of 1812, Hansen became, if possible, even more pro-British. This was more than Baltimore could stand. Taylor writes, Hansen blasted the nation's chief executive for going to war without adequate funding, taxes, troops, ships, and fortifications to fight the mightiest naval power on earth. All of this was demonstrably true, but most citizens of Baltimore didn't want to hear it. To the patriotic citizens of Baltimore, it was treasonous to criticize the nation once it was at war. They responded as mobs do, by razing the paper's office to the very ground and threatening to kill the editor. An eyewitness testimony sworn before a justice of the peace in 1812 said, "On the night of the 22nd June, the office and entire printing apparatus of the Federal Republican was demolished by a mob in Baltimore, in the presence of the mayor, the judge of the criminal court, and several other magistrates and police officers, whose authority was not extended to save it and preserve the peace of the city." One of the editors narrowly escaped with his life after being pursued by ruffians, who avowed their full purpose of assassination. Being a mob, of course, they couldn't stop there. Blaine writes, after this, the rioting spilled over onto the nearby docks. Houses were looted as well as the wharves, and ships believed to be carrying British licenses had their sails and rigging slashed. Upon hearing of the destruction, Hansen decided to find another way to publish the paper again in Baltimore. The eyewitness account explains he was aware that the execution of his plan would be accompanied with much difficulty and danger, but his friends admired and approved it the more on that account, and volunteered to accompany him to Baltimore. They arrived in Baltimore on July 26th. Among those to accompany him was James McCubbin Lincoln. Lincoln had been an officer during the War for Independence. Captured in 1776, he had been held as a prisoner on one of the infamous prison hulks. He had endured hardship, been an advocate for prisoner rights, and famously refused an offer to switch sides for the enormous sum of 10,000 British pounds, saying, "I'll rot first." Recognized as a war hero by 1812, he was a 70-year-old brigadier general of the Maryland militia and a strong advocate of freedom of the press, which is apparently why he chose to accompany Hansen to reopen the newspaper. Also accompanying Hansen was Henry Lee III. Lee was a member of the famous Lee family of Virginia, a family that had produced many early patriots, including a founder of the Ohio Company and a signatory of the Declaration of Independence. The 56-year-old Lee had been a lieutenant colonel in the Continental Army, where he had commanded cavalry and earned the moniker Light Horse Harry. A venerated war hero, had been promoted to major general after the war, and from 1791 to 94 had served as governor of Virginia and then as a Federalist representative in Congress. Hansen had occupied a brick house on Charles Street, from which he planned to resume publishing, but the mob was not happy. Hansen had approximately 20 friends, including Lincoln and Lee, in the house, prepared to resist the mob. One of the men was Mr. John Thompson, who published a narrative account. "I went there and found from 15 to 20 gentlemen in this house, most of them known to him. I was told that an attack upon the house was threatened that night, which they had made preparations to resist and defeat." This was not going to be a war of words. Thompson writes, "I saw some muskets, pistols, and swords in the house for the purpose of defense. After being there for some time, I understood an arrangement had been made, that in case of an attack, the direction of the defense was appointed to General Lee." The expected mob arrived around 8 p.m. Thompson said a number of persons were collecting at the front of the house who were very noisy and began to throw stones at the windows, and they broke several of them. The house was in front completely closed, the door and inside window shutters being shut, till the stones broke the glass and burst open the shutters. Mr. Hansen spoke from the second story to the mob and told them that if they did not desist, they would be fired upon, and he warned the spectators to go away. When the mob didn't disperse, Lee ordered the defenders to fire a volley over their heads, but Thompson reported, "The mob huzzaed, were still more violent, and broke open the lower door." Lee immediately had his men fire again, killing a Dr. Gale, who was removed by the crowd. It was a difficult standoff. A Baltimore judge named Scott tried to mediate, but was told that the men would not vacate the house unless officials forced the mob to disperse. More shots were fired, although Thompson said they never fired but after some new and violent attack. I believe it probable several were wounded. The defenders were holding the house, despite the windows being broken and the door destroyed, but the mob planned an escalation. "Just about or before daylight," Thompson writes, "the mob brought a field piece, which was planted near the house and in front of it. A cannon would have changed the situation, but at that point a company of militia arrived and took control of the situation, followed by the mayor, Edward Johnson, and a delegation of officials, including Militia General John Stricker. Hansen again wanted the crowd to disperse, but Johnson told him the mob could not be dispersed, nor would they be satisfied without we went to jail, and that we should be protected from them in going to jail and while in it. To this proposal, most of us expressly objected. General Lee principally carried on the conversation on our part with the mayor and General Stricker. The mayor, General Stricker, and Attorney General severally declared and assured us that we should be protected as well in going to the jail as in it, and the mayor pledged his life and his honor that we should be safe. that he would die with us if we should be hurt. The defenders were marched to the jail, where, Taylor writes, the Federalists feared for their lives, particularly since the men guarding them were Republicans, just like the men in the mob who were trying to kill them. In jail, the mayor again promised protection and promised to release them after the crowd dispersed, but there was no protection. By some accounts, the militia, most of whom were Republicans, simply failed to muster. When the mob entered the jail, Thompson said they appeared to have a key. The mob proceeded to brutally beat the men. Thompson says, I was struck on the back of my head with a heavy club by some man I had passed, which threw me forward from the head of the steps, and I fell headlong down about 12 feet. The mob continued to beat him, threatened to kill him, dragged him away and covered him with tar and feathers, and paraded him in the street. They drew me along in the cart in this condition, and calling me traitor and Tory and other scandalous names. They did not cease to beat me with clubs and cut me with old rusty swords. When he tried to play dead, a man set the tar on fire. Thompson was only eventually allowed to live, despite threats of hanging, on the promise that he would give the names of everyone in the house. The others were also beaten. Some, a witness testified, till he was supposed by the butchers to be dead. The worst fell on General Lingen. A witness account said, the brave General Lingen lost his life by his endeavors to save it. He so much mistook the character of the monsters as to suppose them capable of feelings of humanity. He reminded them that he had fought for their liberties throughout the Revolutionary War, that he was old, infirmed, and that he had a large and helpless family dependent upon him for support. This only seemed to incite the crowd further. At length, while he was still endeavoring to speak and to stretch out his hands for mercy, one of the assassins stamped upon his breast, struck him many blows in rapid succession, crying out, the damned old rascal is hardest dying of all of them, and repeating the opprobrious epithet of Tory. These blows put an end to his torments and his life. In a few minutes after his removal into jail, he expired without a groan. Martha Washington's grandson, George Washington Parke Custis, said the eulogy at his funeral. The lives of the rest were saved by a Dr. Hall, who convinced the mob that the men were beaten so badly that they would die anyway. While none died that night, the effects of the beatings remained. Hansen survived and was elected to Congress, but died at age 33, largely from complications due to his injuries. Lee suffered from pain the rest of his life, dying 6 years later. It isn't clear how his death affected his 11-year-old son, Robert Edward Lee, but he followed his father into a military career, serving eventually as General-in-Chief of the armies of the Confederate States during the Civil War. The riots continued. As late as November, there were threats to tear down the house of every Federalist in the city. None of the rioters were ever arrested or tried for their actions, and there were no consequences for Mayor Johnson or General Stricker, even though they failed to keep their promises to protect these prisoners. Both would in fact earn fame in the war to come. The brutal actions of the mob that night did lead to a backlash and brief electoral resurgence for the Federalists in Maryland, but it helped to hasten the decline of the party nationwide. Baltimore earned its reputation as a violent city and its nickname, Mob Town. That supporters of the new war would so brutally treat aged heroes of the previous war says much about the division in the nation at the time. Historian Peter Steers wrote in 1980, the blood-stained walls of the Baltimore jailhouse stand as a gruesome testament to the variety of meaning that a diverse and complicated society can have for the laws of nature and reason. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.